Hello, I'm Jackie Bloom, coordinator of Graduate Thesis here at SCI-Arc, and I want to welcome you all to the first of our 3 symposiums this summer. Each year, Graduate Thesis hosts a summer lecture series inviting esteemed guests to present their work and insights on the subjects that thesis students are taking positions on. This summer, we're excited to present a symposium trio leaning on the knowledge and experience of our very own SCI-Arc faculty to exchange ideas on the visionary themes shaping this year's graduate thesis projects: the interplay of AI and imagination, understanding building as an action and a form, and understanding the complex dimensions of ecology. While not all thesis projects may address these topics, it's safe to say that these are impacting the social, political, economic, cultural, and aesthetic ways in which we think architecturally. The hope is that these talks will not only expand the dialogue around your thesis projects, but also give us the unique perspectives from our SCI-Arc faculty panels. Each symposium will differ slightly in structure, but will conclude with an open discussion where you are all encouraged to engage with questions. The upcoming symposiums are called Building a Blank, which will be held on June 28th, moderated by Anna Niemark, and the Ecological Aesthetics on July 26th, led by David Rue. And more information on the panelists will be posted. Today's symposium is titled Techniques of Imagination, focusing the dialogue on the intersection of architectural design, creativity, and ethics within the sphere of generative AI technologies. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, which many of you know. Leading the discussion today is Damjan Jovanovic, a partner at lifeforms.io. His work revolves around the creation of experimental design software, and his interests are piqued by the exploration of the culture and aesthetics of software platforms, as well as the questions of contemporary design and education. He coordinates and teaches 1A in the fall and 2GBX in the spring. Marcelyn Gow is going to be joining the panel. She is principal of Servo Los Angeles, a design collaborative dedicated to creating architectural environments that meld synthetic ecologies with changing material states. She is the co-chair of the undergraduate program here at SCI-Arc and serves as one of the history theory advisors for Graduate Thesis. Karel Klein is co-director of Rehm Klein, and she has been engaged with various AI technologies since 2016. Her ongoing project is an investigation into hybrid image objects produced by unusually trained GANs and generative adversarial networks and their potential for contemporary myth-making in architecture. She currently instructs 4A and undergrad thesis. Elena Manferdini is the graduate program's chair at SCI-Arc and principal of Atelier Manferdini in Los Angeles, a practice that straddles the territories of art, architecture, and design. She conducts a vertical studio in the fall and teaches 2GBX in the spring. Casey Rehm is the coordinator of the Edge Architectural Technology MS program and the Platforms and Automation Lab research group at SCI-Arc. Casey teaches AI, platforms and automation, and giant robot with diffusion for furniture fabrication through his studios, VS, and AS courses, alongside his 18 years of professional architectural practice. So I want to thank you all in advance for your participation in this symposium, and I'm going to hand it over to Damjan to start.
All right. Thank you, Jackie, for the fantastic introduction. So today, So the name of the symposium is Techniques of Imagination, and we will be actually, I'll be starting the talk by introducing some basic ideas that you all know already, and then later, through other talks, we'll kind of get into the more specific like pockets of the idea of AI and its connection to architectural design. But so maybe to start, maybe let's look at this slide, which was basically created by Midjourney, and it was also created by ChatGPT. So it's a combination of the two of the most kind of popular kind of generative AI models, and it's a slide that explains what is generative AI. It's super basic, and I think if we start here, we might actually start understanding that when we talk about AI in the context of SCI-Arc, in the context of today, we are talking about generative AI. We are talking about basically idea that we can use artificial intelligence to kind of create content. And this word content will come back throughout certainly my talk, and I'm sure others too. I think related to this is what is happening at this moment is that we are living through an AI revolution. So these three tools that we all know, like ChatGPT, DALL-E, Midjourney, DeepMind, and others, are just really tip of the iceberg of the whole ecosystem of generative AI. So we have tools for text, tools for sound, tools for image making, tools for creating, game avatars that you can speak to, that NVIDIA presented like 2 days ago. Then platforms for creating different ideas of, music and sound and all the other things that you might imagine. It's part of the ecosystem, but it's really what we might say that we are living through the time of almost Cambrian explosion of these new startups that are all vying for attention, that are all trying to maybe come out on top and present a new business model and a new model of thinking, which is what we are more interested in this context of how humans actually co-create with artificial intelligence. All of this is supported by a technological stack that if you haven't seen this before, I think it's very easy to understand. What is this all built on is simply a stack of compute hardware and then cloud platforms that implement it, and then there are different kinds of models that are deployed. Some of them are end-to-end models, which are proprietary, like Midjourney, where the model itself is the property of the company, and some of them are open source, like Stable Diffusion. Some of them are kind of, let's say, foundational models like ChatGPT that we all use now, GPT-4 actually. And then you have kind of a public-facing apps. So this is kind of the basic idea behind the revolution that we are part of right now. But now some bigger players are entering into the ring, into the arena, and this happened just a few days ago. That Adobe has kind of thrown in the gauntlet and started basically. You can actually download this right now. You can download the new Photoshop beta version and experiment with, I would say, the first official implementation of generative AI image making inside like a large, well-established software platform. And with this one, the results are pretty staggering. Not only technically, Midjourney has had that for a while, but also culturally, because Photoshop is everywhere, and we are all really kind of only a small part of that world. So now things are starting to become more interesting. We are getting into a new hype cycle, right? We're getting people who have last year promised us that NFTs and crypto is the future and is the next best thing. Now they're all talking about AI. We have new ways of talking about art. In this case, we have a person who kind of thinks that Mona Lisa is unfinished, right? And then we can reveal the unseen, or let's say the unknown, just by using artificial intelligence. But some of these results are pretty amazing. especially if you think in the context of art history. I think part of this maybe conversation today is going to be a question like, how do we talk about this beyond the hype cycle, and how do we actually deploy some of our own expertise in curation, in understanding of history of art, so that we are not maybe locked by the endless proliferation of these kinds of surface level takes on AI. But all of these are just examples from the Photoshop tool called generative fill that came out, I think, 2 or 3 days ago. And now you can see, actually, if you always wondered how the whole Mona Lisa looks like, this is how it looks like, right? Another thing that happens is, obviously, the first, industry that will adopt this is the advertising industry. So you already have these examples of kind of content, or what we would say endless regurgitation of existing tropes, and kind of the production of the new that is predicated on the idea of like large data sets of existing human-produced imaging. But now, this is something that as a concept was there forever, but now we have basically that as a Photoshop plugin that you can do in 2 minutes. Other interesting things are happening too. This is a project that reinvents what a camera is. It's basically an image-making machine that has no lens and it has no sensor, and it's basically just a location, using location data to visualize a quote-unquote image from the prompt, and it actually produces pretty amazing results if you look at it. I think this kind of points to a direction where we have to maybe go collectively, is to rethink what does it mean to make images, and are these images actually, or what they are? And one of the most important voices, I think, in this conversation is Lev Manovic, and I really like his take where he describes basically that we are moving collectively from the notion of representation, which is something that we talk about at SCI-Arc a lot, to this idea of prediction, right? He uses the fact that AI tools are basically statistic models to kind of drive home this point that we are all actually using prediction in some way or the other. And I would even, maybe go beyond and say that it's more like divination than prediction in many ways, especially in the way that we're using for kind of production of images. In other areas, we have this kind of famous, just a seed of video production that actually starts happening through AI, and these are very, very early, examples, but they're becoming better and better as we, even from 1 year before, which I think maybe this video is maybe a few months old, but now the newer ones are becoming much more convincing in many ways. This one is trying to reimagine The Matrix as a Wes Anderson film, right? Wes Anderson is extremely popular in this because it seems like he has a clearly defined style with these kind of centrally framed shots and symmetry and color sets. And maybe this is something we can also touch upon today, that certain things are favored and certain things are promoted through the technology, kind of easily understandable visual elements. There is the new Lord of the Rings by Wes Anderson as well. Seems like that he's the only director that is kind of well known. I really like the Gandalf by Bill Murray. I think that's a fantastic idea. And this is enabled by as I show you at the beginning, as these different tools, but this one is called Gen 2 by Runway. It's a text-to-video tool, and you could imagine other things like text to 3D and text to worlds, or text to video games, or text to why not fully architectural projects with all the things that we like to see, plans, sections, elevations, not to mention renders and full models with kind of simulated forces. One day, maybe, but maybe actually next year, you know. Let's see what happens. There was an opposition. I mean, there is actually a kind of a real opposition to AI. It's one of my favorite memes that goes around. It's basically Hayao Miyazaki reacting to very early AI example by someone in his office that they showed him like what will animation look like through the use of AI, and his reaction was, I strongly feel that this is an insult to life itself. But you know, on a more maybe contemporary note, there is actually a kind of a pushback happening right now, and one of the main slogans that people use is "You won't be able to compete." And I think it's an interesting thing we might want to touch upon, basically. And there are calls for ethical AI. There are calls for basically data set transparency and opt-in only, meaning you can only get scraped if you kind of allow it to happen, right? This is further complicated by the fact that we don't really have tools that can kind of reliably detect AI-generated text, for example, right? In this one, you see that the Bible was the kind of 78% generated by GPT. So for those of you who think that we can, I mean, we'll talk about this. That's fine. Other things which are happening is the idea of content that I was talking about, and this is something that came out from as an idea of what the future of the Super Bowl ad will be, and you know, it's a combination of these, or let's say a network of these technologies that work together. I think the only thing that's missing is that AI watching these instead of humans, and maybe that's also coming too. When we speak about content, we can also say everything is becoming content, but also everyone is becoming a content creator. And you can see this in the new Max app, where you don't have any more directors, screenwriters, producers. You know, they're all kind of creators. And any film you might want to kind of check out, it's going to have this list of people who are creators. Some say that this is basically an introduction to a new world where these big streaming services are kind of saying that AI content and human-made content are on equal footing, and because it's all content in some ways. Photoshop, or I'd say Adobe, has started also a new thing called Content Authenticity Initiative, which is going to become, I think, in the next year or so, prevalent everywhere. It's basically a way to guarantee the provenance of a digital file by tracking the creator, right? So you will have almost like a passport of a thing that you create, so that you can prove that it's yours in a way. And, you know, it comes with provisions for AI-generated content and so forth. So things will become much more regulated moving forward. And there is also, right now, still happening, I think, the Writers Guild strike, which is partially motivated by just artificial intelligence. And the Writers Guild is asking that their contract include language stipulating that every credited writer must be a human person, that screenplays, treatments, outlines, and other literary material cannot be written by ChatGPT or something similar to that. And this is really a part of the strike. And there are some really funny takes on this, which I think is kind of, it's kind of hard to disagree with it in a way. Which is to say that we have thought for so many years that, you know, AI will be helping us first, and then not writing poetry instead of us in some ways. There was other things that happened are the letters, and pausing giant AI experiments that was signed by many, many important people, including like Stuart Russell, who is an author of the most important kind of foundational book on artificial intelligence, and then, Elon Musk and others. And then recently there was Sam Altman testifying in the Senate hearing. It was kind of it's a story still in development, and I think we won't see the end of it for a while, but hopefully for us, maybe we could focus on the question of what is it good for, and how do we use it in our work, right? What is AI good for? Because maybe the first reaction is always to say, okay, so let's combine, like, let's take the greatest hits of pop culture and combine it with famous architects. And, it seems like an easy thing to do, to produce images of architecture, really, through artificial intelligence. But is there something beyond that might open up? And some of the things that I was part of here at school as well are trying to kind of mine that like territory, which is outside of pure image making of architectural artifacts. An example would be the work that we did in 1A, which is the foundational studio in Bachelor, where we start from AI images and we kind of produce these things, and then we kind of mine the whole world of these aesthetic artifacts for properties, formal properties, and then try to understand how would they exist materially, or as a drawing, or as an image. Oh, sorry. Huh. Was it? But you can see it now, right? It's good. And there are some examples of that work. And then in thesis last year, I just want to show you Kate's project, because most of you are thesis students. She was working on this idea of extended world building through artificial intelligence to produce a kind of an ecological simulation. And I find the project quite beautiful, because it's really, and it also won one of the Merit Awards. And it's kind of I think it's a world-making project that doesn't focus on producing like literal architectural artifacts through AI, but kind of tries to extend that scope. And a lot of the things I'm seeing right now in thesis with my students also is that using ChatGPT and Midjourney, but also thinking through these things in a different way. And I think this is a good example of that. It's basically a way of making kind of an extended world of the project, more than a single artifact. And I think superpower like AI is something that initially will enable these kinds of conversations about how do you create a world, and how do you create like depth through that. And I just want to end also by one of my own projects that was actually here in the gallery, which is, I'm just showing you just part of it, which is this flag that was kind of designed by artificial intelligence, but it was part of the whole story about the possible future collective that needs its own kind of insignia, and it needs its own kind of symbol to be able to exist. So thank you, and we'll move to Karel's now. I'll close this. Just open yours. Okay, cool.
It's okay. So, hi. I gave a lecture earlier this month on AI and theories of imagination, and assuming that not many of you have seen the lecture, I thought I'd share an excerpted version of it with you today. The title of the original lecture Sing Goddess. Perhaps a bit of a mysterious, even provocative title, but those two words. I keep the slide here today because although the extremely rapid development of artificial intelligence makes it seem that it doesn't actually need us, or won't relatively soon, these two words suggest a romantic, even nostalgic notion of the human-artificial intelligence relationship. Sing Goddess. The two words that begin the Iliad, that ancient and epic poem ascribed to the Greek poet Homer. Within this poetic invocation, Homer calls to the muses, those divine figures revered for their capacity to inspire artists, seeking their aid in the construction of his extraordinary work, asking for their help in the telling of his story. Homer's appeal here underscores the long-standing belief that humans rely on external, often enigmatic, sources of inspiration to generate exceptional creations in music, painting, literature, and architecture. I started using artificial intelligence for the production of images in 2017 and began teaching with it the same year at University of Pennsylvania. From the very beginning, I have been captivated by the peculiar, otherworldly beauty of AI-generated images and have, through teaching and writing and making, sought to comprehend the strange qualities they possess. And more recently, I've tried to make persuasive arguments about their unusual aesthetics and the role AI plays as a prosthetic imagination. Originally, I presented two recent essays in this lecture, each in a different way making observations about the AI-generated image so that I might offer a novel theory of imagination, positioning AI as an external catalyst for creative expression, a mechanized muse, so to speak. Today, though, I'll present just one of these essays, Machines Are Braver Than Art. And here I'm considering another essay by the writer Donald Barthelme entitled Not Knowing. Donald Barthelme, for those who haven't heard of him, is an American writer of fiction known best for his experimental use of language and structure. I frequently share some of his short stories with my students. A favorite is The Balloon, and some of you might know it. A story about New York City and about architecture and about the architecture of a balloon. And I used this story as a basis of a workshop I gave last year on AI literature in the mind's eye. So Donald Barthelme is a favorite. And his essay, Not Knowing, is a brilliantly clever analysis of creativity. In it, Barthelme explores the concept of not knowing as a crucial feature of not only writing, but of all creative work. He argues for embracing uncertainty, suggesting that the best work comes from a place of doubt rather than a place of understanding. I use this essay for the training of a StyleGAN model. That is, I use it to literally produce images based on aspects of the text and to speculate on Barthelme's argument of ambiguity and the unknown when it is now a machine rather than a human doing the creating. Now, in case some of you are unfamiliar with StyleGAN training, let me just quickly explain to you how it works. StyleGAN is a generative AI model that uses machine learning and is trained on very large quantities of images, from which it learns to generate unique images that resemble its training data. So if I were to train a StyleGAN model with images of coffee cups, for instance, I'd show it thousands and thousands of images of different coffee cups until it understood the coffee cup well enough to produce its own unique image of a coffee cup. This is the same AI algorithm that I'm using to generate the images in this presentation. And it is the unique properties of this kind of image generating process that I write about in these essays and I'm speaking to you about today. So I'm not talking about text-prompted image production, but rather StyleGAN training. And before I continue, you may notice that I tend to invoke literature quite often as a source of insight for investigating the weird aesthetic properties of these AI-produced images. And this might make you suspicious. Literature seems so unlike the visual arts and architecture. Any imagery related to literature occurs only in the mind's eye, doesn't it? But so many terms that we use to describe the particular and peculiar qualities of the images that we're interested in are literary in nature. Uncanny, for instance, uncanny refers to the sensation one experiences upon encountering something that is simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar. It is a sensation often associated with feelings of unease, yet despite this sense of unease, or perhaps because of it, one finds oneself drawn to the uncanny. And yet the concept of the uncanny is rooted in the literary. Defined by Freud in his 1919 essay entitled The Uncanny, he also uses stories to describe and illustrate this concept. He finds his argument for the uncanny in The Sandman, a story by E.T.A. Hoffman. And he argues that the uncanny sensation is most often located in the literary. However, as architects, the term is familiar to us, and we often aspire to conjure sensations of the uncanny in our own work. And then there is convulsive beauty, another term that is particularly appropriate in describing aesthetic aspects of these AI-produced images. It's a term coined by André Breton, an author and the founder of Surrealism, a movement that was first and foremost a literary movement and only secondarily a visual art movement. Convulsive beauty, according to Breton, refers to a particular aesthetic experience characterized by paradox. The so-called fixed explosive was one category of convulsive beauty. This might describe something like an object which hovers at the threshold between the mobile and immobile, convulsing, so to speak, between the animate and inanimate. This property, not entirely unlike the uncanny, was also seen to be unsettling and offered glimpses into the surrealist aesthetics of the irrational unconscious. But it's not just the literary terms that make literature such a potent analog for the aesthetic sensations produced by these AI images. Written works can evoke mind's eye imagery, sensations, and experiences that one longs for in the experience of architecture and of the world. Arthur Machen calls this ecstasy, a state of heightened perception and awareness that allows one to experience a reality otherwise obscured by day-to-day existence. This more meaningful reality differs from our ordinary experiences in that one becomes more sensitive to profundity and beauty, to the sublime. Machen argues that true art, and especially literature, has the power to evoke this sense of ecstasy. And so if I'm drawn to literature and to these strangely beautiful AI-produced images, it's for that sense of ecstasy. And it's because, as an architect, I want architecture to induce the ecstatic state as well. And so I interrogate the AI images in the hope that they will offer me insight into this matter. So we begin, as Donald Barthelme begins in his essay, Not Knowing, with a list of ingredients reminiscent of a recipe. 1 azalea bush, 1 gold pocket watch, 1 handsome thief, and 1 chastity belt. To assemble, position the azalea bush in the park, wind the watch, place both it and the thief beneath the bush with the chastity belt securely locked onto the thief. As the elements in the scene are laid out in anticipation of what might come next, Barthelme embraces the problem of imagination that we all face, of the uncertainty of what to do next. This state of not knowing, he argues, is what enables art to be created. It allows the mind to brood and bud and is essential for invention. This territory of uncertainty is brimming with possibility, and it is the unique property of language, with its remarkable combinatorial agility and its ability to endlessly produce meaning, that allows the inexplicable to linger long after the not knowing has become known. And I was curious to think harder about StyleGAN models and their training because, like language, they too have an astonishing combinatorial agility and the ability to suggest endless possible meaning. I was curious to use StyleGAN to model an aspect of imagination by offering the AI these same elements: the pocket watch, the azalea bush, the handsome thief, and his chastity belt. I thought I'd ask AI to produce something like a fiction, and so the question became this: how does the concept of not knowing, an essential element of creativity, function when the desired knowledge lacks a knower? William H. Gass writes that, quote, "the purpose of literature is to capture consciousness." And it's a beautiful quote, to capture consciousness. And it makes one wonder what happens when there's no consciousness to capture. In other words, what is it that artificial intelligence doesn't know here? And what kind of imagination can its peculiar form of not knowing give rise to? And so I offered AI those same elements. I built a library of thousands of images of azalea bushes, pocket watches, handsome thieves, and chastity belts. And I used this library of carefully curated images to train a StyleGAN model. What's important to remember and to consider here is that when Barthelme presents us with the thief, the bush, and the rest, he takes it from the world of conventional signs. When Barthelme refers to a pocket watch, he relies on our shared understanding of what a pocket watch is within our cultural context. When we read the words gold pocket watch, we can immediately picture one in our mind's eye. We don't hesitate to consider the characteristics or features that might distinguish one gold pocket watch from another. On the contrary, we are quite satisfied with the knowledge of the idea of a pocket watch. This understanding, which is part of the world of conventional signs, allows us to grasp the concept of a pocket watch without having to know any specific details about a particular one. In semiotics, this shared understanding is based on the relationship between the signifier, the word pocket watch, and the signified, the mental concept and image of a pocket watch. However, if we were to train an AI StyleGAN on pocket watches, it would no doubt be able to produce an image of something resembling a pocket watch, and it would do so convincingly and with ease. But it would not recognize it as such. A StyleGAN model trained on pocket watches will never know the meaning of a pocket watch. It will never know it semiotically, as a sign or a symbol. Instead, it would focus on the visual aspects and patterns found in the training images and try to replicate them. It would learn to reproduce aspects like shininess, roundness, reflectivity, or the little tiny marks on what we would call its face. This highlights the limitations of AI when it comes to understanding objects in the way humans do. But this limitation is exactly how the AI can operate as an exceedingly unusual faculty of imagination. A model of imagination unique perhaps to the machine or to the machine-human collaborative hybrid. This world of conventional signs that encompasses language, and especially the words that are the names of things, is a world unfamiliar to AI. It is the understanding of these signs and symbols which our AI primarily lacks. It is what our AI does not know, and its lack of this knowledge here allows us to problematize the role of signs in the construction of meaning. So let's go back to my StyleGAN training on the pocket watch, the azalea bush, the thief, and his chastity belt. Because I'm training the model on all four things at the same time, if the AI were familiar with the world of conventional signs, it would have to object to this training. It would immediately recognize that an azalea bush is not a chastity belt nor a thief. It would know that each object means very different things, or simply that they are different. At this point, it should discontinue its training because this is clearly a misuse of the algorithm. This StyleGAN model is intentionally being mistrained after all. But it, of course, doesn't object to learning the images it's being trained on. And in the process, it complicates things. In the manner of the remarkable combinatorial agility of language, it combines, it miscommunicates, it makes ambiguous. But it makes ambiguous with incredible clarity. It produces results that must be experienced unburdened by a system of signs and symbols, and it produces effects that are in excess of meaning. So this is the point where I return to literature and a short story that I think beautifully explains what happens when we try to detach semiotics from our sensibilities, when we are made to experience the world unmediated by signs. The story is called She Unnames Them, written by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a very short story, first appearing in The New Yorker in 1985, taking up less than a page in the magazine. The story begins as the protagonist, who we realize later is Eve from the biblical book of Genesis, although she is never actually named in the story. We won't talk about her again today, but Eve and her penchant for being curious returns in the other essay about AI and imagination. The story begins with her asking all the world's animals if they would like to give back their names. And with few exceptions, they do so with the perfect indifference with which they had so long accepted and ignored their names. And as she finishes unnaming them, she becomes aware of new insights into them and new traits shared between them, traits that jumble categories, making, for instance, the hunter indistinguishable from the hunted, and attraction inseparable from fear. As the now nameless animals disperse and depart, they do so in this way. The insects parted with their names in vast clouds and swarms of ephemeral syllables, buzzing and stinging and humming and flitting and crawling and tunneling away. What she has done by unnaming things is make the world wholly aesthetic. She cannot describe the world anymore with common nouns, and instead must use gerunds, stinging, humming, flitting, and blurring. The story ends with her walking away between the dark-branched, tall dancers motionless against the winter shining. The trees and moon, now unnamed, are apprehended as pure aesthetic sensation, as qualia, those internal subjective components of perception. Finally, this is how our AI copes with the concerns of not knowing. Just as Donald Barthelme begins with those now familiar items, bush, thief, watch, and belt, we presented the same collection of things to our AI. And just as the writer finds himself, after each stab of his pen, not knowing, so does our AI. Our AI cannot represent the world through mimesis because it does not know the names of things. It cannot comprehend the collection presented to it by way of a priori knowledge of those things. Instead, it presents its efforts as uncanny blends of palpable imagery, loosed from any meaning or signification, what surrealists called authentic photographs of thought, that is, direct glimpses into the AI's prosthetic, machinic imagination. It rewrites the world into ineffable fictions with each new collection presented to it, and it remakes the world as utter optic sensations, pure aesthetics, fashioned without names, embracing what is not known.
Great. Okay, so Casey's next. Yeah. It's better.
Sorry.
You want to start playing or?
No, I got it.
You got it, okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
shit.
you can do that.
Oh,
That's that one.
this one?
You need to jiggle.
It's got a jiggle?
No, it's good. It's good. Yes.
Okay. Hi, so the kind of brief for this conversation was to kind of pick a specific territory within a kind of conversation around artificial intelligence as maybe a foundation for how we think about its role as a kind of generative or imaginative tool, and like one that we think is significantly consequential. For me, I've been working with different forms of artificial intelligence since about 2003. And it's actually kind of fun that Marcelyn will be joining us later, as she participated in curating an exhibition at that time called Mood River with Jeff Kipnis, and as part of the kind of lecture he gave on that exhibition, he was describing about kind of complex systems, complex adaptive systems and multi-agent systems as a way of understanding design culture. And for me, someone who was coming from a background in biology initially before architecture, I had this kind of sudden kind of awakening, like, wait, I can use all these nightmare linear algebra models I learned to design stuff. And so that kind of kickstarted this whole thing. So for me, I wanted to kind of talk specifically about an aspect of this kind of territory of algorithm or territory of computational design. That is the fact that these intelligences we're working with, or these kind of machines or abstract machines we're working in, are highly contingent. And I think that this begins to separate it from some of the kind of computational work that maybe has happened at different periods in time that we're leveraging things like kind of fundamental computational models and cellular automata. The foundation of artificial intelligence, and I'll be mostly referring to it as intelligent agency kind of moving forward as a kind of more specific and direct term, is predicated on this idea that these are machines, this is software, stacks of software and hardware that are not kind of isolated or separated from a context. It is, in fact, highly dependent on that context as a way of understanding the world or acting upon it or manipulating it. This diagram is extracted from Russell and Norvig, who Damjan mentioned at the intros, kind of one of their fundamental texts, Artificial Intelligence, or a Modern Approach, Artificial Intelligence, a Modern Approach, where they begin to break down the kind of definitions and classifications of like what is an intelligent agent. And it's something, this is a series of diagrams that I kind of scraped a couple of them off in order to kind of build a context for the discussion we'll have about, or at least that I'll be broaching about the kind of contingent nature of these machines, to create a kind of understanding of what the kind of mechanics are of these systems. This kind of diagram has its kind of history in the cybernetics project. And I'm going to skip ahead a little bit on this. I'm going to be jumping massive time years because this is kind of a short thing. But fundamentally, the idea with an intelligent agent is you have a kind of environment, you have some kind of encoded body. It has some mechanism for sensing, for bringing information from that environment into it. Those pieces of data which are coming into the machine are kind of known as percepts. Those sensed pieces of data then need to be configured into a way in which the machine can kind of utilize that data, and that representation of data is something that we'll be talking a lot about today for the machine. Then there's some kind of mechanism for making decisions based on that information provided by the representation. And then that goes to a set of actuators or something that can put that kind of those decisions back out into the environment as a series of actions. This model, like I said, has its roots in kind of cybernetic theory. In the upper left is Norbert Wiener, who is kind of one of the godfathers of cybernetics. So we actually recently had a lecture in our program, in the architectural technology program, from a cybernetician from the Berggruen Institute. And I'm actually cribbing this quote from his presentation because I liked it better than the one I used to use. But Wiener was specifically trying to design a system for engaging phenomena that were kind of outside of the human capability to respond to or react to. And specifically, he describes the cybernetic machine as something which kind of is a kind of de-entropification machine, or something that removes entropy from a context, the kind of position that the world outside of the machine is this noisy, chaotic space. It's a stochastic environment of kind of meaningless data, and that the machine becomes something which can be utilized to, and specifically in Wiener's case, to project control over that environment. And so I think one of the things that I want to carry forward as a kind of concept underlining this is this notion of these machines as machines for control, at least in their kind of historical paradigm and the conceptual paradigm in which the kind of types of AI that we're working with are framed. On his case here, like it was also like a wartime project. It was a defense project. He was specifically trying to identify how to track fighter planes with anti-aircraft weapons without having to understand anything about the pilot's intention. And this is another aspect to the types of machines that we're all working with now, is this idea about how do you build intelligence or an understanding, or like at least at the level of some kind of utility of something being perceived without any understanding of its internal motivations. So purely building a response to something through external awareness. And you know, it's been kind of interesting over the years to see how these kind of concepts come in and out of architecture as they get also revisited in the biological sciences, political sciences. You know, in the bottom row here from left to right, we have Nicholas Negroplanti's Seek in 1970, Rainer Banham and Francois Delegate's Anatomy of a House, which is kind of a stripping of a house down to its mechanisms of environmental control. And then also Cedric Price's Fun Palace in 1964, which was influenced by his collaborations with a cybernetician named Gordon Pask. And we'll actually come back to Pask a bit at the end here as a kind of alternative, but I want to stay in this world that these are machines of control, at least for now. So when we're talking about these kind of neural net models or learning models, we're going to begin to expand this intelligent agent and talk specifically about this piece right here, initially, which is the kind of trained model. I put some like moving animations behind, like my students, some of you may have had this in a seminar. I refer to it as the super boring neural net lecture. We go into a lot more depth about the kind of mechanisms here. But Damjan said it should be visual, so we're making some like a AI wallpaper for like nursing homes right now in the office. That's not really what we're doing, it just kind of looks like that to us. So there's something besides the diagrams. And specifically within the kind of trained model, you know, the kind of speciation of intelligent agent model that we leverage within the office, that we've leveraged within my studios over the years, it's vast, and all of them have their kind of peculiarities and particularities and like reasons that they're interesting, reasons why they have value in this kind of conversation. But today we're going to kind of specifically, I just want to talk about some of the more recent kind of learning models, like convolutional neural networks, like the style again that Carol was talking about, or the kind of large language models like ChatGPT, or stable diffusion, which is the kind of, which is a diffusion model, which is the image generation model at the current heart of Midjourney, to start out with a different one. That within this kind of one box here, in this kind of cybernetic diagram, there's its own kind of training that happens, that is its own cybernetic network or feedback loop, where rather than with a lot of the type of models that we work with, which have the kind of fun name of GOFAE, which is an abbreviation of good old-fashioned AI, which is basically the models that dominated before about 2012.
Good old fascist AI.
Fascist?
No, I'm joking.
No, fashion. Although, again, you know, we're talking about control ultimately, so yeah, fascist. Is this concept that rather than the kind of author of the intelligence codifying behavior explicitly, they're also kind of referred to as semantic AI, where you actually are writing the rules of behavior, the kind of, if I see this condition, do this, do this, do this, which positions a significant amount of authorship on the designer of this model in terms of the things that it produces. Well, this one's not moving. That one's moving. It's okay. Oh, there we go. So the kind of fundamental difference here is that these types of models operate on this idea that you create this like massive mathematical stack of interconnected weights that start off with kind of a priori random values in terms of these kind of weights. They're all kind of float values or numbers on these weights. And then you just show it a bunch of stuff. And then you say, machine, figure out the rules for how to do this kind of stuff. And it's this kind of, you're showing it in vast quantities of information, and slowly over time it regresses the values in this intense network until it starts to produce a behavior that you find desirable for whatever task you're applying it to. And so I wanted to kind of lay this diagram out because, like, ultimately when we were talking about where architects can begin to position themselves in the creative process of working with artificial intelligence, I would argue that each one of the positions in this diagram are positions that are not only have significant impact on authorship and creation and the kind of creation of the imagination, but are increasingly accessible to non-expert developers. And that I would actually argue in the case that as architecture is moving forward in the kind of trajectory of automation, the automation of intellectual labor, that is in fact imperative that we begin to position ourselves as the authors of these mechanisms, engaging each one of the steps in this diagram here, including the environment. Okay, kind of moving forward, I want to just specifically talk though about this kind of, again, this nature of this machine being contingent, and about the role of specifically the kind of box that says training set, the box that says sensors, the box that says representation of the environment, and the box that says percepts. The kind of fundamental underlying magic trick, let's say, for the neural networks is that there's this nihilistic reduction of any data or content you're feeding with it, no matter what it originally was, into what could be called like a vector or a matrix of float values between 0 and 1. Float's just decimal number, 16 or 32 decimal places. So 0 to 1 seems limited, but it's actually like a pretty huge gradient. And this allows for some incredible things that were impossible tasks within the context of the GOFE or within the kind of brute force cybernetic models of the 60s and 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s and 2010s. Like 2012 is a pretty significant point where this type of operation actually becomes an effective model and not just a theoretical one, even though it was originally proposed in the 1970s. The kind of magic trick of folding everything down into a decimal point representation, the first kind of consequence of that is it allows you to kind of learn patterns and data sets that are outside the mechanisms of the human mind to perceive. That the alternative mechanism of understanding, or maybe let's be careful about words like understanding and comprehension, but let's say like a pattern recognition of these types of machines, by viewing it through this lens, allows it to significantly outperform the human for many tasks. The second thing that it allows you to do is it allows you to correlate disparate aspects or different species of data, different things, an image, a sentence, a voxel model, a structural model, an environmental model, ultimately get folded into the same matrix space, allowing a kind of nihilistic stripping of and flattening of the ontologies of previous meaning into the kind of same ground truth, flat ontology. And then the third thing that it allows is the kind of automation of seemingly subjective tasks, something that was outside the scope of capability of kind of prior forms of intelligence. As kind of an example of the first, these types of models are actually where the significant portion of investment was placed initially within neural networks, the kind of models for finding pattern, the models for analyzing. You guys remember Snowden, like, and the whole like NSA recording all your phone calls thing? So there was a huge problem there that the NSA was recording. I mean, there are a lot of problems there, but I'm just going to talk about a technical problem. The NSA was recording all our phone calls and storing them in a warehouse in Utah. The problem was that they had no meaningful way of understanding anything that was happening in all of those phone calls. There was a collection of data in the anticipation that one day they would be able to generate relevant information from that kind of exceedingly vast amount of raw stochastic data. And so the initial investments in these models was specifically towards this application, not in the terms of like generative image production or generative text production, although interesting, we'll see how these models got inverted. This is a case where this is specifically a utilization of image classification models to detect cancer cells in mammograms, which is kind of its own fascinating subhistory of AI and ethics and regulation. But ultimately, there became a problem where mammogram resolution got high enough that I'm not like undercutting doctors or anything here, but like there was basically, the resolution got high enough that it made it impossible for human doctors to perceive cancer at the same level of efficacy that they used to from actually lower resolution scans. So artificial intelligence kind of vastly outperforms human, what do they call it, oncologist at this task. The other thing is the kind of correlation of disparate percept types, right? This ability to kind of flatten, in this case, robotic toolpaths, LiDAR scanners, LiDAR scanned point cloud fields, text inputs for the description of an image transformation, image segmentation, all into the same kind of apparatus. This is kind of a real physical cybernetic loop from that first diagram that we ran for our seminar this past spring in the large robot house. Most of the work that I do in the robot house is centered on this idea of kind of utilizing stacks of hardware and software to produce a kind of evolving contingent physical and digital aesthetic. And then finally, the kind of automation of seemingly subjective tasks. This is a sample from a current project in Architectural Technology Studios by Yuteng Chang, who has been looking at producing a full automated stack for brand development for fashion. And one of the kind of early tasks that he looked at was kind of fine-tuning the language models like GPT-2 as a way of automating and replacing the industry of trend forecasting. Specifically, was targeting the Lydia, you know this one? I'm not a fashion person. You can probably tell by looking.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. Anyway, she's like the biggest trend forecaster. It's Lidwidge Edelcourt? Edelcourt, yeah. I think Case knows, he's the one who kind of introduced her to us. But this idea that you could begin to correlate and predict the next season's kind of fashion trends based on the current ones by analyzing the history of keywords and trend description across multiple seasons of production, fold that into a kind of interactive image generation app utilizing those keywords in combinations with kind of user-selected environments as a way of kind of automating the design of brand aesthetics. And I think his goal by the end of the semester is to have everything from a kind of graphic package for web development to pop-up stores to mini runway shows. We'll see. We got 3 months left, so plenty of time. But how am I doing? Got like 5 minutes left?
You have like 3 minutes.
3 minutes? Okay. I'll go quick then. So for me, the kind of aspect that gets me excited about these types of models, going back to this idea of them being contingent, is that my view of architecture is it's one of the most kind of heavily contingent forms of design practice. And my goal in leveraging this type of tool is specifically to allow us as a profession to begin to acquire more territory that we've kind of slowly begun to kind of bleed off since the late 19th century as kind of steel caused a bifurcation with engineering and architecture. And I see it as an ability for us to kind of consider and fold into the same kind of design scheme things beyond the pure aesthetic, looking at kind of environmental, structure, all these things. So like AR and magic, but I just want to kind of wrap up here really quick. Ooh, I had another one. No, here's some projects. There's it's not magic, right? Like there's a problem here. Like this, you guys watch Succession? I really no, okay. There's a guy, he's a tech bro. The PR lady's worried about him making some faux pas at the party, and he was like, what, I shouldn't scream, people are data, and stick my dick in the guac. But that part about people being data is a kind of fundamental issue with this. And I think it's why it's critical for understanding how we are representing the things that we're training the model on, where the blind spots are. Like, yes, there's fantastic potential in leveraging the ability of kind of reducing things to this kind of float value vectors feeding in, but like, what are we eschewing? I think this is an example of a current project in the architectural technology program by Gaurav Dua, who is looking at, partially is about kind of adaptive reuse and automating reverberation of ruins or complex sites, but also this notion of like designing with a question of ancientness when you have, again, this kind of nihilistic stripping of any kind of history or cultural heritage behind the aesthetics of these kind of ornaments and effects that are being leveraged there. What are the questions of appropriation? What are the questions of cultural value and rhetorical value when you strip things down to just the kind of image in three-dimensional form of a part? Some examples of those. The same thing, like my friend Daniel Kohler is working with Midjourney. And I think the Midjourney, to me, is a kind of very interesting case as we begin to look at how we maintain authorship and credibility as a design practice within the kind of world of these kind of large language models and image production models. Particularly in the fact, like Midjourney, I think is a special case. It's utilizing a model that we work with a lot in the studio called Stable Diffusion. It actually started out with something called Disco Diffusion. It doesn't matter. But beyond just the idea that when you're working with Midjourney, you exist in a position of authorship exclusively here. Beyond the kind of training set being something that you have no agency over, Midjourney gets the kind of consistency of aesthetics and consistency of effects by heavily manipulating the text prompts that you put in. So there is an embedded intention by the designers of Midjourney to make sure that it never makes a bad image, which to me is a fundamental problem as someone who is a kind of creative producer of image and aesthetic content. That there is a kind of, let's say, like governor, like something that's kind of limiting your speeds to say that only this narrow bandwidth of aesthetics is an acceptable space for us to begin to operate in. As a kind of reflection here, the Stable Diffusion model that Midjourney at least uses as a basis, there's probably a significant amount of fine tuning in it based on the types of images it produces. This is, there's actually a site you can go on to search the Leon data set, which Stable Diffusion is trained on, which is 5 billion images. I just typed in, show me the top 8 architecture images ranked by aesthetics, and this is what it returns, right? So when you are working with this machine, and you all should be, like it's a fantastic tool for accelerating versioning and scripting, but I think you need to be careful about understanding like how much you're playing into a kind of what's either referred to as kind of stochastic parroting or inductive stagnation of a kind of probabilistic tend to a homogenization of aesthetics. I think particularly with a tool like Midjourney, you are clamping yourself into giving authorship over what the realm of aesthetic development is to someone else to a level that I'm uncomfortable with. Stable diffusion is a different story because when you're working with that model, you have the ability to interject yourself into each one of those boxes as I listed before. And then finally, last one is the kind of question of the large language model, which has definitely been the most significant innovation in the last 2-3 years here. And particularly in the kind of capabilities that these large language models, which are kind of trained on vast quantities of information on the internet. It's the GPT-2, which is the last one that they published, the kind of full stack of how they trained it for a whole number of reasons. Was trained on 8 million websites. They found the websites by using something called Common Crawl, where it just went to any website that had 3 upvotes on Reddit. And that was a good thing to add to the canon for an English language model. GPT-2 significantly bigger, GPT-3 much bigger, GPT-4 we have now is astronomically larger in terms of the kind of pattern recognition it can do and the kind of depth of words. And what's fascinating is that these models, kind of flying in the face of predictions from most people in the artificial intelligence industry, kind of except for Sam Altman at OpenAI, is that they are now showing kind of glimpses of general intelligence, and that they are models which seem, because of their, even though they're trained exclusively on language, seem to have the ability to use language to represent solutions for other tasks besides conversation, including writing code, describing images, playing chess, poorly in all of these cases. There seems to be this underlying potential now that this type of model could be expanded to general applications across a vast language of territories or percepts or environments. And so I think one of the questions that we can want to look at then when we understand like that this model seems to show an increased efficiency for understanding pattern, understanding kind of generative potential and problem solving, is that there seems to be some kind of efficiency in linguistic description over things like kind of pixel description or voxel description or any of these other kind of representations that we use for architecture. So fundamental to that, I think, is a question about what is the kind of way that we begin to represent architecture for these machines to learn, right? This is just an excerpt. Spring 2022, I taught a seminar in history theory. They don't usually let me do that. And I kind of panicked and said, okay, you guys can write your papers with GPT. This is pre-chat GPT, so it wasn't that good. But the fascinating things was to see how the students began to leverage this. In this case, this is a project I really love from John Penvos, where he fine-tuned GPT to be a re-embodiment of Walt Disney's urban designers for Epcot, and interviewed it and asked it to describe a new iteration of the Epcot city, which was an unrealized utopian project. And just putting this up there as kind of a last slide, because back then we were using Disco Diffusion. We thought these images were pretty impressive, and they're kind of embarrassingly bad 1 year later. But also just going back to the kind of contingency and the data sets of these things, and the fact that we shouldn't be relying on other people to frame what these models are learning for us exclusively is one of the most difficult things to do with these models at the time. Now it's very easy to fine tune them, was to get them to draw 2D images. So, and the cheat that John found for drawing master plan drawings was to tell it to draw them in the style of a kindergartner with crayons. So those are the highest quality urban design plans we could generate at the time. Thank you.
Give it this to. It's much easier.
And yeah, with the slides. So I will talk a bit about bias and AI and what it means identity today. Identity is a mirror that reflects the different cultural and social factors that shape us as humans. And it refers to a person's sense of self, meaning how one views themselves as compared to other people. Identity has always been a shifting concept, not immune from fictional narratives, stereotypes, and appropriation. But the recent rise of our digital alternatives has drastically changed how we see ourselves. I think the biggest triumph of the digital age is the transfer of our identity to the digital space, to the cloud. And this is not merely a mental transition, so it's not just how addicted we are to our cell phones, but our bodies are online as well, with our pictures, voices, and locations, all present through an interconnected set of shared data. We have witnessed a paradigm shift in communication technology, where togetherness can be found virtually. So today, with the hegemony of digital media, identity is online. Once upon a time, identity used to be digital and have tangible, to have a tangible manifestation, because it could not be meaningful without the acknowledgement of others. But today, social media has fostered online communities, and our thoughts and most intimate feelings have been uploaded. Cindy Sherman subverts the visual shorthands we use to classify the words around us, drawing attention to the artificiality and ambiguity of these stereotypes and undermining their reliability for understanding a much more complicated reality around us. Text messages, pictures, and geographical coordinates have been compiled into a shared set of data that constitute our digital neighborhood. Therefore, our senses of self is split between who we are in real life and how we represent ourselves online. Avatars, face filters, deepfakes are just the beginning of the manifestation of a larger global transition of our sense of self into the cloud. And so I think AI questions who we are today, what we look at, how we interact, and the possibility of being reimagined, while also speculating on what happens to architecture because of these digital alternatives. I think the digital turn has forced us to redefine our online persona, has challenged the constructs of who we are as individuals, and has granted to all of us the possibility of being reimagined. And I think today, identity is full of new potential and also new risks that come along with this role playing. This is a book that has been just released, and what I'm gonna show you is a work of that book on AI. 2022 has been the year of the text-to-image generators. Midjourney, Disco Diffusion, DALL-E have been spreading like wildfire, with foreseeable impact on the current creative economy. Among these image generators, I think Midjourney differentiates from the others because its visual results are pretty by default, as have been very eloquently explained by Casey. And they're capable to produce an overall fine art aura in a variety of styles. The tool is currently open to everybody and allows its user to feed in their prompts and generates image akin to the text. So trained on a wide set of images of different art and architectural media, styles, and historic precedents, this tool associates reliability of aesthetic images, often delightful and whimsical, to simple text prompts. So the text really is designed to unlock the creativity of ordinary people, and I like to highlight this, by giving them tools to make beautiful pictures just by describing them. This is how David Holtz, Midjourney founder, describes and explains the tool. So it's about ordinary people making beautiful things. And it's not so distant a future when visualizing one's imagination will be open source, real-time, three-dimensional, and interactive. So this tool that now we all train will become three-dimensional quite soon. And so design as we know it will no longer belong to a relatively small group of well-trained individuals, which I think we're all part of as architects. Visualizing one's imagination will be a fully democratized practice, taking place in online communities where we are co-imagining. And these new human aesthetic open source visions will spill out into the real world somehow. And it's not so distant the future when we will have a three-dimensional version of Midjourney. And while this tool is without any doubts a game changer for designers, I also think that Midjourney visualization are also proven to be a perfect mirror of an imperfect society. AI images are generated by models trained on a data set of publicly available pictures amassed over time. Therefore, it's not surprising that they proliferate images that are dominant in our culture, along with inventive and new aesthetics. In short, AI image generators could be as racist and misogynist as a data set they're trained on. And I wanted to give myself an exercise when I was starting to work with Midjourney for the first time, and I decided to work with an exercise of self-portrait. And it comes from looking at other people's artwork and somehow responding to it with a new tool, which is AI generation. It's a project that could be loosely associated with a self-portrait. It's inspired by the work of artists like Tomoko Sawada, Cindy Sherman, and Glenn Ligon, whose artistic production is dealing with identity. And in particular, I was looking at the work of Glenn Ligon from 1993. He produced a series of lithographs titled The Runaways. And not dissimilarly from Midjourney, an AI program that you all know that creates images from text description, Glenn's prints stem from word prompts. So the artist did something funny, I think, which I loved as a concept, asked a group of friends to write descriptions of himself as they were reporting a missing person to the police. And these were his own friends. So the description Glenn received read like accounts of criminal suspects or racial profiling by law enforcement. And so the artist drew parallels between the text that his friends wrote and the 19th century advertisement ads published by slave owners to locate runaway slaves. And so Ligon explained that his work, Runaways, is broadly about how an individual's identity is inextricably connected by the way one is positioned in the culture, from the ways people see you, from historical and political context. The piece raised questions about identity and became a visual manifestation of how far-reaching these constructs and prejudice are and remain today. Another artist that I used as a source for this self-portrait exercise was Tomoko Sawara. She works with identity and dominant cultural stereotypes. She's a Japanese photographer that shot myriads of self-portraits to reflect on women's identity and their characterization. Using costume details, hair and makeup, she takes pictures of herself multiple times and constructs a prolific photographic imagery of herself. Her matrices of faces from afar appear as a wall of conformity. In front of her, spectators are uncertain if these pictures belong to one or more women, bringing to the fore the risk of generalization. Her catalogs raise questions regarding women's individual expression, self-image, in a society that educates them to conformity. And so this art was all question stereotypes and convention, and they explore attributes such as aesthetic, self-image, gender, and heritage. Ultimately, they make a case for cultural sensitivity and for a wider representation. And here we go back to Midjourney. So instead of asking my friends to give me a description, I gave myself a description, I typed it into Midjourney, and I started working with Midjourney every single day for a few months. The piece is called Pick Me, and it grapples with issues of identity at the time of an emerging AI. So the images could be loosely associated to a series of self-portraits that came from a text description. But they're not produced by using a collage or a cell phone camera. They're generated by Midjourney, departing from a single text input. So there is only one point of departure. So the series of a temporal progression of faces. And the first AI image, the one on the left, are rooted in cute Japanese cartoon styles per text input. The last one look like headshots of beauty pageant contestants. So this is the span of the bias of Midjourney through the process of producing multiples. Scrolling through the faces, viewers notice that the age of the women oscillates from childhood to womanhood, and their initial manga cuteness transforms in disenchantment, sadism, and substance abuse. This AI-generated series has revealed how cuteness is an aesthetic commodity of the powerless in our culture. There's no sound? Yeah. So the idea of cuteness came from Xian Gai in her book, Our Aesthetic Categories, the zany, the cute, the interesting. She says cuteness is a way of aestheticizing powerlessness. It hinges on a sentimental attitude towards the diminutive and or weak, which is why cute objects, formally simple or non-complex, and deeply associated with the infantile, the feminine, and the unthreatening, get even cuter when perceived as injured or disabled. So there is a sadistic side to this tender emotion. That's how she explains it. And I was trying to test exactly this with Midjourney. Does the word cute go from being what we understand cute to be to a much more darker version of itself? So this kind of piece, I think, reflects on the effects of contemporary aesthetic judgment on female self-worth and how media stereotypes connect aesthetic pleasure with violence. And also as a display of the ways in which AI, if you give it enough time, are subtly proliferating dominant cultures within powerfully beautiful image. They're all extremely beautiful, but after 1,000 of them, it starts revealing its own nature. So the man-made, unfiltered data sourced online introduced the model to the existing biases of mankind. Essentially, AI is holding a mirror to our society. explains Prisma Labs about the existence of biases in Stable Diffusion. And so while it's impossible to fully eliminate human bias from human-made tools, it's important to question if AI-generated images might end up reinforcing a dominant culture while simultaneously they produce speculative visualization that we all love. And a final project also I would like to mention that William, Virgil, and I took on the same exercise, let's say, of self-portrait. So this became a small show in a gallery called Role Play. That also was the first experiment I did with Midjourney. When Midjourney was not perfect, actually, and somehow was more interesting the way in which it produced, yes, it produced more interesting output. In this case, was quite simple, was a connection between robotics and Rococo furniture. And it starts really creating a variety of visualization that then became a series of NFTs and went then into three-dimensional realm. So somehow it spilled from a text to images, to NFT, to 3D model, into a three-dimensional output, which is completely opposite to what usually we would do in an office, where we would have to model something and then render it. This actually came about the other way around. And so it was a bit of an experimentation of how you use this beyond the flatness of the image. And so this was the final piece. Yep, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all very much. And let's have an applause, you know? We are joined by Marcelyn Gow, so please. I think you know, just listening to all the presentations, it's incredible to see or to hear just the amount of like really big questions that every participant is kind of raising, you know, from everything from identity and bias and whether or not this is constructed by some kind of external forces, which is what maybe Foucault would argue historically, to maybe Casey's notion of agency and control and what that means, and does it actually exist outside of the, you know, the setup of the machine. And I think in Karel's case, the question of meaning and this idea of basically poetry and whether or not we can kind of go back to some notion of re-enchantment of the world through an engagement with these problems. You know, for me personally, what was incredibly kind of maybe clear through the presentations was that we don't have maybe a clear answer to what is AI good for in architecture yet, and I think that's quite exciting because it's a way to maybe open up some versions of that of like thinking through these kind of really profound issues. But I had maybe a question with regards to what is maybe always the case in every presentation, is that we are still producing content which is maybe peripheral to the history of the architectural discipline in some ways. It's images and it's kind of flat media. And maybe one, let's say, critique we can have on AI is that it doesn't produce space yet, in a way. And maybe, or does it? You know, maybe we can have some conversation around that.
Yeah, I mean, I clicked through fast. Like, sorry, it turns out that running an office based on automation is like super labor intensive, so I didn't get a ton of sleep last night. But some of the stuff I clicked through is, for example, solar canopy array that we're doing in West Africa right now is because, it's fully three-dimensional space generation. Desert House from now 6 years back is like, a fully three-dimensional AI-generated house. You may not like the designs of these things and the way we're approaching it, but like, glossing through a lot of things, like basically anything that you can format into a consistent data structure or describe in a consistent data structure can be learned by a machine. So it's just, there's no revenue for pursuing 3D right now, or it's much smaller.
Okay, I think the other question is probably the question of beauty, which probably kind of goes through every presentation. I think there is an intentionality towards the aesthetic expression that is probably what ties together these questions. I think what you're saying somehow seems like that it points maybe to a certain idea that there is a truth behind these models, and the truth is contained within the kind of agent architecture itself, that somehow AI is, on its own able to kind of solve these problems that we are.
I think that's the kind of opposite of what I was positing, that in fact, that each one of those kind of moments in that contingent model are moments of contingency that you are exerting authorship over and defining for you what is the kind of significance of the model or the value proposition of the model.
So it's still you have to define, basically.
Yeah.
You have to curate, you're someone who has to bring their own expertise in a way. And it's more an expertise of maybe of curation and kind of culture than, correct me if I'm wrong, this is my reading of it, and then the expertise of the model itself in a way, which is what defined, I think, the digital project for since its inception was the, let's say, the difference between the origination of that through computational models, through algorithms, and the way that we always read them was like always back to that origin, that we are able to kind of model the world and understand the world through modeling, right? This is, I think, the promise of, let's say, the parametric project, at least, was that we can have a clear image of the architectural project in a way. And it seems that is really complicated by AI, I would say. Maybe Marcelyn, you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed the presentations. I think you all touched in very different ways on some of the aspects of how we work with AI that bring up, issues related to generalization. And, I'm thinking of a story by Jorge Luis Borges with the character Funes, the Memorias, who wanted to invent a language. He could remember everything he had seen in exquisite detail, every detail, a leaf falling from a tree as the sunlight reflected off the leaf. And Borges reflects that Locke also proposed an analogous language which would have an infinite number of words to describe the state of this falling leaf, for instance, and the impossibility for this character in the story to actually function in a meaningful way in the world because he was incapable of generalizing. And so to me, it's very curious that the way we attach words to the images that we're maybe training it on, or the way as it's scraping, and we say the pocket watch in Carol's example, for instance, that my encounter with all the pocket watches I've ever held in my hand will tell me something. There are a number of qualities associated with that, the weight of that, the coolness of it, the things that get eradicated. So we may be presented with this data set that is kind of equivalent to the word pocket watch. But I guess for me, that's kind of a huge question of, as you brought up in the outset, Damjan, is it the AI watching this content, or are we, the humans, still the observers?
Yeah. Maybe Carol, when it comes to this idea of qualia, I was very curious to hear, because this has been a conversation about really, especially in 1A, we were talking about this question of like properties of objects and how AI actually learns from properties of things, and it seems to be very kind of related to this problem of qualia, right? And some neuroscientists would say that qualia exist, which means like that you actually, as a human person, you have kind of empirical experience of color, for example, right? Like you understand red as an experience. And some say that actually it's almost a hallucination in a way, which I think opens up this problem of how is that any different than AI? Because, you know, Casey was talking about symbolic AI, and that is something that started with Wiener and you know, von Neumann and after the Second World War. And their idea was that we have to understand how the brain works first, and then we can simulate it by kind of symbolic logic in a way. But what seems to be happening with these new things is that we don't need to understand anything. Because if you throw enough data onto this pattern recognition statistic engine that Casey was talking about, it's just gonna, simulate the thing. And not only the image, it's gonna simulate the response in a way, because it's, you know, it can learn from it and so forth. So qualia, I think, to me, that's a really interesting kind of problem to think about. Like, what do you think about this idea of the simulation? And I think it's related to the problem of personhood and identity. Like, it might turn out that there isn't such a thing in some ways.
Well, what I'm thinking as you're talking is, having just recently listened to a neuroscientist who is involved in AI. He's also a mathematician. He's also interested in meditation and psychedelics. So he kind of crosses the mind in these various ways. But the way in which he describes how vision works, a lot of the AI that we're engaging ends up being kind of a mimicking of the mind and vision, the sensory input. The way he ends up describing the mind and vision, I mean, he's a neuroscientist, and AI models were based on the way that we model the brain. But yet, the way he's describing it, now that we know so much about the way AI works, sounds just like AI. Layers and features and the parts of the brain that can recognize straight lines versus curvature, these kinds of things. But he's describing how our minds work, yet he's also describing how we understand AI working. And it's fascinating because I think it calls into question what we call reality and the way that we understand how we individually but also collectively perceive the world. And I think perhaps the takeaway is that there's and I think this has been mentioned recently, is that now that we have these AI models, we're potentially able to understand how our minds work better somehow, ironically. It's a kind of curious inversion of understanding the world, understanding ourselves.
I think it's super interesting because there's a quote by Philip K. Dick that goes like, reality is that which does not go away when you stop believing in it. And I think still, even if we go in this direction of saying that it's kind of a simulation, I think what Elena was bringing up, this problem of bias and embeddedness of these like presuppositions that are culturally shared in the models, I think that's still kind of going on in a way, and it's going to keep on going on, it seems like. So to me, I think the question of identity is super interesting because the more things change, kind of the more they stay the same in some ways. Someone was saying that we have godlike technology and like Bronze Age emotional kind of equipment in a way, but
I thought it was interesting in the process of making this piece that was a series to see how much Midjourney changed within a year. So I started with version, I don't know, 1 or 2. I mean, as soon as they gave me the beta, and then at the end, I think the last version was the version 4. It's not even the latest. Yes, now it's 4. But I finished at 4 when I printed everything, and I thought, even in the process of making those images, they changed because the version changed, and therefore the output became much more stylized and somehow more correct. It became much more faithful to what one would have imagined from the prompt. and also more distorted in terms of what the dystopian quality of that could have been. And it made me realize that somehow there was a soft point in the model where I thought it was not perfectly correct, that actually had many more options. When you would regenerate, it would actually produce something that I was not expecting from a prompt, whereas now it gets it much more. And I think it also makes it less interesting as an output for a designer. Somehow it just channels a common denominator that we all agree on should be somehow an output of that images, of that text, which I think has completely changed. If once upon a time, if I even remember, we taught together, Carol, you and I, and also Jackie and Herwig, we taught one class, which was to GBX 1 year ago. And at that point, I thought was very struggling there was a struggle to go beyond and to really bring your imagination to match the visuals of the AI and the difficulty of the production. And then I think there was a great spot where actually that was a very productive one in Midjourney, and then it became somehow
Oppressive beauty.
it became, when you even regenerate, it doesn't regenerate. The 4 options are almost the same right now. So it becomes, it's interesting there is only one correct answer actually right now. So I think it's interesting that we have gone through this mirror of perfection somehow. Is that the direction? Or maybe I think somehow Casey explained it very well, like how much you can operate as a user within those models and to create disturbance, I think, to the perfect answer, to the perfect text.
Yeah, I think this question of what you were saying, that we are training the model and then it converges more and more in some ways and ends up producing things which are less and less aesthetically adventurous.
I mean, that's specifically, looking at something like Midjourney, where, there's a group of engineers and there's a company that is actively framing and defining an aesthetic space. I mean, you look at the kind of the 5 billion Leon dataset trained stable diffusion models, which is also the one that's underneath the hood of Midjourney, I think since V4, certainly now in V5. And the kind of range of aesthetics that you can provoke from that, even without getting into like fine tuning, is it's vast, and it certainly raised a question about like what the role is in fine tuning. And I also wanted to kind of, I went way too long. I'm sorry about that. But I glossed the last. I meant to end on a happy note.
We understood that. I can tell you that.
Like I started the conversation about the models of control and like cybernetics as a kind of control model, and certainly like the kind of Foucault definition of architecture as a kind of way of disciplining a population, because texts on hospitals and so forth really fits into that mold and really fit into the kind of work, particularly of Negroponte at the time and Rainer Banham, less so with Cedric Price and the kind of evolution of it, which Gordon Pask was part of. And I meant to end on a kind of, which is already fairly old now, but like Catherine Hale's kind of revisiting or adaptation of cybernetic model, not about kind of controlling environment, but creating systems for allowing coevolution, which is meant to be my like, hey, it's going to be all right. Like we have the agency to kind of continue to evolve these aesthetics.
So coevolution, I think it's a wonderful word that actually came in the first like cybernetic age in the 60s, right? Mm-hmm. There was this idea that we could, in principle, kind of just not merge. I mean, that was an idea too, like all watched over by the machines of loving grace, this idea of merging with technology. But I think in this way, does it mean that specifically Midjourney model, right? Was that a coevolution that produced the convergence, or do you think there was some kind of external input that what Elena is saying, that the forms of beauty that we kind of expect and now we see, that was kind of planned by someone, Yeah. I feel like that's a really interesting question.
Midjourney is a full-on Foucault image production project. Like it's about disciplining a population. Stable diffusion allows for coevolution. It's open sourced. It allows people to tinker, evolve it.
You should trademark that. Wow.
I mean, like the motivation, and like I also had some slides with some of the kind of existing AI software for automating architectural tasks in practice. Like the motivation for this is capital. Midjourney is aiming for not aesthetic innovation, but to get the most kind of stickiness, to get the most people to engage it, to most easily return images which a larger population will view. as beautiful or acceptable, right? Like, they're designing it for the market, and they're designing it to avoid the grotesque. And
The unseemly.
the aesthetic term of things which sit out are collectively decided upon, or at least population, scale, mass decided upon aesthetic agendas, right? Which is something which oscillates, right? Like Hernan's project was initially about the kind of grotesque in the face of the kind of projects on elegance and around that early digital thing, and then now I think his stuff is kind of part of the oeuvre now,
The
right?
same might be true of words as well, that the idiosyncratic gets removed, and the problematic, the non sequitur, the gap, the space of like where it doesn't seem to have a logical connection. And so I wonder, in essence, then we're being trained to understand these things. Like Elena, you brought up the word cute, that, okay, within our category of cute, then this is what we can imagine. And so, in effect, it's almost like things are being removed. And I was very struck by your description, Casey, of the sort of limitations of that space. And who decides?
I don't want to kind of too much tech and dominating this, but like a similar thing happened that we're describing between Stable and Midjourney with GPT. Like ChatGPT is a fine-tuned model of GPT-3, which had this tendency to produce erratic things or things that we didn't understand as language, and they actually manually fine-tuned it by evaluating, like in that little loop I said about the kind of loss layer, saying like there's an error here, we need to fix this. They had humans as that loss layer, so there was actually fine-tuned by human supervision to ensure that it would more consistently produce text that was acceptable as human dialogue from our perspective. And GPT-4 is, we're not fully aware of like what's under the hood there, but there's something similar there where there's a vastness to the model that should incorporate things which we would read as non sequitur or like unruly. I mean, it has 170 trillion parameters that can be combinatorially configured to lengths of 25,000 words. Like, there's a lot of weirdness in there, but they tend to, like ChatGPT is just a specific case where they've tried to iron out those peculiarities.
Going back to what Karel was saying, that it's a model of a human brain in some ways.
From the 50s.
From the 50s, but still, does a human brain have more word, like vector embeddings and word space than that? I mean, this is a question that is interesting to kind of ponder, because we might like conclude eventually that it's really kind of at the same level of that it's a black box, right? And I think to us as designers, it was always interesting to kind of know what we're dealing with. But now the kind of the final black box is here. So it seems like the only response is either belief or some kind of, or let's put it this way: is there a way to kind of protest against in a creative way? Like, can you be punk? In the face of AI, and how to do that when everything was subsumed. Every historically punk project or any type of image making is already there in a way. So it seems like the way to say it is not to do images anymore or something, I mean, does that make any?
I mean, I have an answer.
I didn't know it was directed at me.
Oh, yeah.
I think there are, I don't know, I don't want to also paint this tool as being a negative tool. I think has the capacity to be highly democratizing. I think it just needs to be framed differently. What is the role of the designer? Is the one of making images has been taken by a tool that produces them more successfully in a faster pace, and somehow with a level of precision that is going to only increase. And we can also predict, I think, that this will become also three-dimensional. Whereas in my project, there was a lot of manual labor to go from one to another. I would imagine that will change in a very short amount of time. And so I think what changes in our workflow as designers, it might actually accelerate and give much more potential to what we do in terms of the way in which we operate in our offices or design offices. I think also maybe erases some difference between the expert and non-experts, and I think that's actually a great thing to say. also, I think, becomes a democratizing tools in terms of knowledge. I can imagine ChatGPT and the way in which one could program it or allow a certain level of knowledge to be isolated within a model to be a perfect aid, to be teaching, to be helping, to be actually giving and offering a personalized support to one for all students. I mean, education, I think, has a potential to be truly democratized. And I think that's an incredibly powerful aid for learning and developing new knowledge. So I somehow I think that there is always a fear that this new technology might change the way we work or diminish the level of expertise of architects or designers or writers. And I can see the ethical issue behind it. These are models trained on the work of artists. So I mean, there is nothing about it. So we cannot negate that have not been paid for their work to be used in the training model. So I think that to me is an ethical issue. But beyond that, I do think there is a democratizing power behind them in terms of who then access to express a certain level of visual intelligence, creativity, desire, and what kind of orbit then we can create around certain audiences. So I think is actually quite powerful as a tool. I mean, I just want to put this out there because we look at this in our response, which is maybe a sometimes selfish response of the designers, thinking, "Oh, this is something I did, and now I don't get to do that anymore." But maybe other things will become actually quite important around this as an economical model for whoever works with these tools, which seems to be a big majority of what we do.
I think one question related to that is like Midjourney is accessed through Discord, and you kind of co-creating with other people. Like going back to Casey's point about like co-evolution, I think it's maybe is authorship moving away from a single individual into these more kind of distributed ways of thinking, and how do we teach that, or how do we think about it first, and then how do we obviously talk about it as well.
I thought Karel had the perfect analogy with Odyssey, sing goddess. That also Omero was blind, so the idea that he couldn't see, but he was a writer. So whatever, it's just the myth behind it. But the fact that he couldn't see and whatever is written comes from the idea that you're not the genius. Even the concept of the genius, in terms of creative terms, did not even exist at that point. The idea that a personal intelligence or talent would create something extraordinary is a concept that came much later in the history of creativity. Actually, Omero was blind, and the idea is that you would be inspired by divine intervention to write a text that was somehow of importance to the many. So I thought it was a great beginning of the AI, somehow taking away the idea of authorship and taking away the idea of genius behind it.
We cannot.
So I guess the genius is more in the masses than in the personal imagination.
I think that's a great point. I think just one point to that. There is a theory of the mind called the bicameral mind, which is not. I mean, it's kind of not entirely like supported by any evidence, but it's an interesting thought experiment that says that at that time in human history, humans did not have like a complete understanding of themselves as a separate person. That what Greeks called gods, they were just like voices in their head, like everyone else has an inner monologue voice, but they thought that that was something external to themselves in a way. So it was truly a kind of a collaborative, not only with other people, but with yourself, like you are many, which I think maybe what we can say is that if we learn something from AI, we can learn maybe that creativity and authorship was always a product of many, even if it's done by just one person in some ways. Anyway, maybe we can open up to some questions from the audience. If there are some, I would love to hear maybe from the students if you guys have some thoughts or questions, anything. Remarks? Or yes, go for it. You can direct it to anyone, it's totally fine.
To the group. I think that conversation of authorship is really interesting because I also don't think that as people we necessarily create in a vacuum either. It is so much fed by like those inputs, and so it feels to me like a parallel system. And I wonder if you guys have thought about that at all, or is it as a distinct thing versus a mirrored kind of practice?
Something that I was struck by the difference between thinking about the Gass quote about the capturing consciousness and something that Zadie Smith writes about, the act of writing as communicating with a consciousness other than my own. So imagining this kind of fictional reader that she needs to imagine in order to write in that sense. And then I was thinking about your term, Casey, the intelligent agent, and the difference between what might we define as a consciousness, one with which we might collaborate versus the intelligent agent. So I don't know if anybody would like to reflect on that. In connection to the question, because I think it's an excellent question. There's also
Harold Bloom's anxiety of influence, which is just an argument that one always has to confront all of the work that has come before oneself in order to kind of engage it and be almost embrace it in order to kind of produce novelty, in order to kind of take it and move forward. So there's always that. There's always the influence.
I mean, I think, for me, this idea of kind of engaging with another intelligence is fascinating, both in terms of a way of, and like, I think we have to be super clear that it would be dangerous to say something like a large language model that's trained on vast production of a collective is somehow representative of that collective in some kind of one-to-one way. But the issue of consciousness has never been like a particular interesting factor to me. In fact, the thing that I find most fascinating, and I've always been obsessed with the kind of, even the GOFE and the kind of multi-agent systems and complex adaptive systems, is the kind of alternative view of the same problem that I might see. Particularly like this as like examples. I love the fact that like image classifying networks can organize or curate like an art historical kind of survey in a way that would be totally outside the context of the architectural or the art history discipline, and like one of the kind of specific aims of our early neural net based work, or like again, like Desert House is like 6 years old now, but was specifically an aim to produce a kind of viable floor plan that was unanalyzable from a perspective of kind of Western formal analysis, that this thing is somehow still effective as a residential structure, but it doesn't have the kind of organizational hierarchy and forms that we could recognize and draw a diagram or party. For me, these models are fantastic ways of beginning to try to pull intelligence or solutions or value from, vast quantities of other agents, whether they're, human population members with consciousness, or, a lot of the kind of evolution of the cybernetics project came from like Margulis, who was coming from a microbiology point of view, and the kind of coevolution of bacteria. And there's a fascinating way about like way bacteria might solve its state within a context or that kind of contingent environment that it exists, which is outside the way that we would approach it, right? And so for me, it is about this kind of plurality of values, and that AI is a way for us to begin to access that and leverage that.
We have a question here.
Thanks. Hi, thank you. Great presentation. Thanks so much to do these symposiums, and thank you to share your personal works. I would like to ask you more of a school image or school perspective, what the school is trying to send as a message to the outside world from the school. Obviously, it looks like you have different approaches to AI, so the school right now is taking a diverse approach to it. So this is interesting. Diversity is important, and I think it tackles different issues, and the presentations were very, very different, and I think there's overlaps, but you have a very strong personality towards language and the way you get. Is there some examples of other schools of architecture design that you've been looking, or are we looking? Is there some case studies there, how AI is entering that field? First question. And then second question is more about in the different roles of the different faculty we have as experts here in AI. Do you see, I was very intrigued with Karel's position on ambiguity and surrealism and ecstasies and also the idea of entropy. And is there a part of the school that should be working on fields of design and architecture that AI cannot get there at this point or yet, or keep that creative tension towards an area where AI should come here, or the producers of AI, companies and so on, that would say, well, you are still developing a territory that we haven't entered. So, because it's interesting to navigate the wave, to surf the wave, for sure, right? But what about designing the wave? What about intriguing, exploring, hacking, disrupting? No? Disruptive innovation has led us to many new territories of exploration as designers, as architects. So perhaps disrupting AI could be also, but it's a question. You really know. I'm an outsider. I just got to this school a couple of weeks ago, but it's what you are sending out to us. I think it's a great work and a great challenge. Thank you.
I think at the table it's true there are people that truly have invested many years in AI, like Casey and Karel. I would say Casey has been working with AI for a long time, and I am an outlier. I just used Midjourney. So I am not at all an expert, and I came to this in a much more superficial way. I wanted to make sure I could understand what the tool was when it became a reality. I think it just took everybody by surprise, the speed at which I think a body of research that has been relatively steady and maybe on the horizon on the table, on the desktop of many faculty, then certain tools came. They came to all of us somehow, and whether or not you were a researcher or whether or not you were an expert, you could use partially at least the capacity of those beta tools that everybody had. So I think there is a response of the school to the fact that I think every student and every faculty right now is engaging in this. I think it truly is a democratizing tool in that way, that somehow I would imagine that almost 90% of the faculty and 90% of the students here have that tool or have experienced that tool or have used it for some reason or another. So I think the speed at which 2022 this came into the creative field and also writing field, I think nobody can deny. I would imagine that most schools are facing the same paradigm shift. And designers are just one small portion of that. Every time we go speak to other administrators in other schools, there is a lot of positions about what AI can do in every field of studies, and what we're doing is maybe quite minimal in comparison to what the field of medicine or and many more. So the science and somehow the investment is everywhere, an energy that I've never seen before. So I think we're not special in that way, maybe. I'm just gonna try to say the truth. I think we are responding, like most people are responding to a paradigm shift in architecture and in every field of creativity, but also science. And in terms of schools, I mean, many are starting to put out publications and papers, and many, in the United States, there are a few that are already coming out. The difficulties is mainly to make sure that your book is not outdated before it comes out. Yeah, so all all the work done in 2022 is now feeling outdated in comparison to what now gets published. So publishing houses to go faster just in order to feed something out that is meaningful. So I think that, and in a way, I also think of the global classroom as something that has been for sure brewing. We all collaborate with each other. We all see each other's work on social media or platforms of exchange, Discord, and I think that also creates a common culture that breaks the boundary of schools. I would imagine, I call it the global classroom because I think we are aware of everybody else's work, right? Nowadays, it's impossible not to see it. I think it's great to see the variety of work, and I actually think it's great to see the work that Casey and Karel do, because I think somehow they are showing us the different ages of AI and the different kind of control one could have on AI, which I think is an important and valuable asset for the school in general to keep control on the ways in which these tools will, of course, become commercial tools. There is a high investment behind them. So I don't imagine them to go easy on the way in which they can commercialize it whenever there's a giant investment like this one. So it will become mainstream. And I think we will see all of that on the table. I don't think one can bring this back into the Pandora box. I mean, I think it's out there. But maybe Casey.
Of the program that I coordinate in the postgraduate is that that it's imperative for us to be like I think the worst thing that architecture can do is to treat these kind of AI models as some kind of benevolent received thing, that we 100% need to be participating in exerting agency and towards the development of them and the kind of integration of them, like thinking about how they can allow us to, like I said, I think we can use them as tools to begin to expand our kind of capability and expertise and understanding of the building as a kind of complex system. Like, I think there's a lot of things we do in building practice, which is where kind of, you know, again, like research is often driven by capital. And so this is a lot of what we, if we just allow that to happen, a lot of things that we see are just like saying, okay, set aside this part of the problem of making a building so that we can focus on, you know, the facade or some other aspect of it, right? Like this should be tools to allow us to take a kind of more comprehensive view. And also, as architects, we need to be kind of reshaping the discipline specifically to have an understanding about how to shape that. Like the intent, like all of the students in our program, like learn how to disrupt, break the models, reapply them. We throw past the wall, fail badly, and we sometimes land on our feet. But the students are graduating, going into the world, developing these projects in the world. You know, like Sidewalk Labs, which is, you know, certainly one of the kind of more significant software companies in terms of automating architectural practice or aspects of it. You know, Josh Chapin is an architect. He's from GSD. Like, he's one of the heads there. So this is not something where we have to just kind of hang out and see what comes down the line from Autodesk and these other things. So 100% we need to be instrumental in reshaping it, because it's in the same kind of impacts that things like BIM have had on the professional practice. This is a kind of exponentially more significant impact on the future of professional practice, which will have kind of fold back into the academy, the reshaping of the discipline, the kind of quantities of people even participating in the practice of design, right? This is a significant ground shift in what can be automated within the context of the office, and also the kind of investment required to do that. So yeah, we need to be doing that. I think it's critical. I think every school needs to be engaged with disrupting, engaging, reshaping the future of AI and architecture.
But I think specifically at SCI-Arc, you know, there is a full stack engagement, like from first studio in first semester of B-Arc to all the way up. And I think, you know, it's also like building technology and building understanding of technology is maybe one thing, but I think more significantly is building ways of seeing that are enabled by the technology and that are kind of like prompted or promoted, things that we don't know how to, or let's say differently, when we don't know how to respond, I think that's the interesting moment, because we can build that response. And I think that's the real knowledge, right? I agree with Casey that we have to somehow find ways to engage with existing models and hack them on a technical level. But to me, that's going to be always an uphill battle for many reasons, right? I think it's, to me, just personally, is much more about building ways of seeing and ways of understanding that are specific to us as designers, as like cultural agents in a way, because I like this word agents. It implies agency and intentionality in a way. Midjourney has no intentionality until you prompt it. And I think that's what we have to do in a way, like build that knowledge.
But I have to say, we are now in a culture of the swipe. No, it's a smooth culture. You swipe, it's a fast consumption. So I just also want to say that we're at the point in which I think there is a certain level of superficiality of how we consume technology, and a certain level almost of reward in the fast pace of how the technology responds to our desire, our expectations. And I think that will always propel incredibly fast. Although I understand why we should tackle the issue, I do think that the commercial orbit and the kind of audience and the kind of habit of the superficiality of the swiping in technology as well moves this as fast as it is doing now, and I think it would be very hard to contain. I think that I think it's a cultural issue. The tolerance to the time it takes research, or a single person. Is it a single person project in a university, or it's a giant corporation with funds? So I think that's a bigger question. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to also not make something seem harder than it is to engage with at a level. I get concerned about kind of trend in architecture, about there's a lot of discussion about the kind of cultural relevance of the discipline, the kind of valuation of the profession at a larger level. If we continue to avoid territory which has significant impact on the things that we are supposed to be expert on because they're difficult, then we don't deserve the kind of cultural respect or the kind of financial revenue or the kind of correct market valuation of what we do. So I just get nervous about saying, oh, this is, we could never really engage this when, like I said, like some of the heads of these companies are architects, like we can do it. And I think we have to be serious about it. I think we need to not shy away from hard problems to avoid the kind of obsolescence of our field. But I'm also just a really cranky, like negative person all the time.
Well, that was actually super.
I completely agree with you. We must be inside the wave, change the wave, be the wave.
Yeah.
I'm with you absolutely. Just my last clarification, and the floor is everybody. Knowing the work of Servo for all these years, and what's happening with an architecture that is driven by agents or parameters or data-driven, or is parametrism now in the way you see it inside this big AI wave, or is this a parallel track? Or how do you position this? I think it was mentioned in the different symposium conversations, but
I think.
How do you see areas of design that have been and are very important, like agent-driven? Alice Andrasek or Matias del Campo was here also. Is this inside AI? Is this a parallel track, or is this the place where AI will not get, or?
Well, maybe that's thinking about Bestia, I think that was really a fascinating. Do you know about Bestia, the exhibition that Casey curated with Hernan? And many of the faculty here were providing images of our work to be used for training. I mean, you should speak about the technical, I don't want to get it wrong, but the discussion at a symposium we had after that was, to what extent do I even recognize something that was generated from images of work that I identified with? Like, I would call this initial image that I sent my work, but it was also the down-resing of the image, like the fact that it could only be a limited number of pixels. There was a moment where the fidelity of the image was like starting to already distance itself from what I would identify as like my work. It became something else. And then when it went into the kind of mix, I think it was quite fascinating that, that collective intelligence, I guess, of the many designers producing things, that we could all recognize like aspects of our work, but I think no one would say, oh, this one is really mine now.
It's like, just in terms of the kind of conceptual framework of, what's now described as kind of parametricism, which, had its previous life, that actually, Marcelyn came through and Carol, Elena,
You were never parametric.
They're not parametric, but they did stuff in the 90s that, actually Marcelyn in a lot of ways is like, I think you may have had the first, Servo did the first kind of multi-agent installation that I saw with that kind of, there's a lot of stuff that like I go back to like, it's so fun to teach her because she had like an outsized influence apparently on my worldview between those installations. But, and I mean that seriously, like I know it's hard to tell sometimes. But I think the kind of main shift, I used to work with Cecil Baumann as a kind of computational, like Skunkworks consultant, Roland Snooks, Carl Chu, like a lot of those kind of generation, Rob Stewart Smith, and I know Alyssa. That kind of model was always interesting to me. I think in some ways that this is too long, but that generation was working with GoFei, like we were working with multi-agent systems. I think the kind of big shift between that and here is one, even though those systems are systems that were developed for these kind of contingent external engagements in the kind of math and sciences, there was still maybe some kind of flywheel effect from the influence of Carl, who was obsessed with the kind of perfect world building, right? The kind of fully enclosed computational model. So a lot of those projects that, a lot of the code I wrote for those guys was about this idea of this kind of discrete computational model that would describe a whole world and a whole system. And it was based on the GoFei model. And I think Damjan was like kind of alluding to this as that kind of shift from the GoFei to the kind of learning models. We use the kind of two big shifts I see is this kind of forcing of the contingency by engaging external data set at the bare minimum as a way of automating design, but also while like I know at a conceptual level and in some ways like a specific coding level, the structure of those models, like we cannot go in and
Don't know it really.
we don't know what the specific, what this weight over here on this layer is the one that's making this a cat. You know what I mean? Like there's a kind of distancing or abstraction from that model that I think, I still use a lot of semantic AI and symbolic AI in our work. There's a lot of tasks and problems that it's very well suited for, but there's also just a kind of absurdity to trying to create a perfect model of a world through that rule-based system.
I feel like that's the main point, because what you were saying in your question is very, to me, that's the kind of the crux of the matter. You were saying, how do we lead, right? Like, how do we go back to this idea? And I think what AI opens up is you're looking at a black box, like, and you know that there is, what Casey was saying, no one knows how it works. Like the engineers who build AI, they understand how to put it together, but they don't know what happens in layer X, vector, whatever. Like it's unknowable. Like it's too big, all of it. And we don't have, like they call it explainability. Like we don't have tools to explain it, to visualize it. Like, so which means like that's the main difference between AI and parametricism. Like literally, because parametricism was ideologically grounded in the idea that you understand your world model. Whatever you're building, you know it top to bottom, left to right. You understand the full thing, right? And that's why Patrick's like 2 massive books are this big, because like that's the world we are building. we are now building a new reality through models, through math, and we are the architects of it in a way. And AI just like throws this in the air and tells you no. You don't actually know what it is. And I think that it's commensurate with our like non-understanding of the brain in many ways. Like it's an analogy, but it's really not even in this way. So I think the question, like, how do you engage it? It has to be thought through this, like outside of the question of control. in the classical sense. And this is maybe my only the kind of disagreement. It's like I understand that we want to have control, and we think that that's the mastery of it is what is important. But what Carol was saying, I think there are other ways of attaining relationship through poetry, through kind of things which are outside of it, engaging with it in some different ways, treating it more as an open-ended like reality in a way, which is kind of interesting because it's an abstraction, it's a model.
I think that speaks to like this idea of beauty as well, and through doing that, through asking questions, you're able to create that nuance and not like reinforce that kind of specific.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, I'm also very new to this, so sorry if it's a naive question, but is this our biggest emergency right now as humanity, like dealing with this? Well, that's the first question. Second, can we still have any kind of agency, or can we now only adapt and create contingency plans?
For the whole humanity, but I think it is a pretty big like topic, and which is kind of there is a, that's why I showed the writers' strike, because it's happening right now here in the city, and it is because of that, because of the kind of the unleashing of a like artificial intelligence that will it starts to actually have political ramifications. Obviously, there are many other things which are happening, and but just to me personally, I do think that it's a something to be kind of looking at intensely, especially because of the whole idea of like creativity, imagination. Historically we thought that AI will automate like boring things, first, but somehow it seems like there are other things happening maybe, and I think it's an interesting problem to deal with it. Yes, that's but everyone can have their own answer for sure.
Also because it seems that if we solve this, it solves other things.
Solve?
Like the ecological crisis.
Yeah, you should, Sam, the CEO of OpenAI, Sam Altman, he's someone to watch. I mean, for a while now, but especially now with his investment in the fusion technology, which has the potential to actually kind of bring, let's say, post-scarcity economy in a way, right? So I think that's a significant thing, and it's tied to this problem of AI actually. So and not only through this person, but through the whole web of technologies that are working together in a way. So I think it's totally, we are on a verge of something new, I guess. I think to me, the question is like, what kind of tools, conceptual tools, thinking tools can we develop? And how do we build those? This is what I'm interested in mostly, like building these tools. And these are, I think, applicable not only to design and architecture, but to other things as well. Like finding a way to coexist and maybe co-evolve with this technology, and not going into the like extremes in a way of either like nihilism or like total faith, right? But I think that's a question. Yeah. Oh, we have to finish. I'm sorry. Well, thank you very much to our panel, to Elena, to Casey, Carol, and Marcelyn.